mental and physical illness are the same. And that's where we have to start. What is it to be a human? And this is really where polyvagal theory finally led me, in that it was that to be a human was to be socially connected with others, to be able to trust someone of your species.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Chasing Consciousness. Today, we're going to be talking about the neuroscience of safety and how our sense of safety can be hugely important to the way we communicate and learn. Research shows that when we perceive threat, we go into a hyper-vigilant state, and certain circuits of the brain shut down in some way to focus on self-protection. So my feeling is that if we can be aware of this as it's happening, we can not only use certain tools to mediate it, but we can also help others that we're communicating with not end up in that state because of us. So today we are extremely lucky to go straight to the horse's mouth, so to speak, of this research, speaking with Dr. Stephen Porges. Dr. Porges is the founding director of the Traumatic Stress Research Consortium at Indiana University. He is Professor of Psychiatry at the University of North Carolina and Professor Emeritus at both the University of Illinois at Chicago and the University of Maryland. So a very experienced professor. He's published more than 300 peer-reviewed papers across many, many disciplines. And today we're going to be speaking a lot about his Polyvagal Theory, I think from 1994, a theory that links the evolution of the mammalian autonomic nervous system to social behavior. And this theory is leading to innovative treatments based on insights into the mechanisms operating in several behavioral, psychiatric, and physical disorders. Also, particularly interested in the fact that he has created a safe and sound protocol, which currently is used by more than 1,400 therapists to improve spontaneous social engagement, to reduce hearing sensitivities, and to improve language processing and state regulation. And of course, he is also the author of several books, which we'll be mentioning in the interview, some for a more specialist readership, but also some for people like myself who are looking to get their head around this without any specialist neuroscience technology. So I cannot wait. I'm so excited. This is one of the most important interviews, I think, of this first series, although they're all so important. So without further ado, let's go. Dr. Stephen Porges, welcome to Chasing Consciousness, and thank you so much for taking the time out to join us. How are you?
I'm doing fine today, and thank you, Freddie, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be online with you this morning.
It is quite an extraordinary story, the story of your career. You're not at all an average neurobiologist. I'm so curious about scientists' personal journey, and so I really like to start with childhood and with those first ideas that may have influenced your choice, as you came to the end of your youth. Were there any ideas, those first big philosophical questions that just gripped you, that you just felt you had to answer?
Well, I mean, the answer can go in many, many different directions. So the story, you can come up with different narratives. This is the beauty of one's life, is that you try to describe it, you try to make a narrative that's meaningful from it. And what you're doing really is justifying your passion and your motivation. So there's a dualism in terms of how I would view my world and who I am. And I actually will go back not just to my childhood, I'll go to who my parents were and where their journey brought them and who their relatives were and their survival as, we're going to talk a little transgenerational trauma. As immigrants come from different countries, they come and they bring their personal stories. Who are they? So my father his family came from Czechoslovakia, Austro-Hungary. They came from outside of Bratislava. So they came over, but a lot of the characteristics of the Central Europeans who came to the U.S. At the turn of the 20th century, they had a lot of, I would say, German strategies in life, very concrete, very organized, more of an engineering model. It wasn't about feelings. It was about appearances. It was more object-oriented and less, let's say, visceral in the world or bodily feelings. My mother's family came from Eastern Europe. And it's the total opposite. Since they had difficulty in owning objects, they became, in a sense, a more spiritually oriented, a more intellectually oriented. And so it's an interesting merger of two different philosophies of life. One is basically suck it up and survive and thrive, which is, not so far off from an English model.
Well, quite puritanical. I was just going to say,
yeah.
I grew up with those kind of Protestant values, absolutely.
Yeah. And this Eastern European, which is life with misery is life itself. It's like, whether you're reading Dostoevsky or any of those issues, it's like suffering is the journey and the pathway of living versus suffering is not even to be mentioned. So you have this dualism of, in a sense, different attributes of being embodied. Let me go there because we're going to get there at some point. Definitely. So one, in a sense, more of an intellectual narrative and one more of a let's use the term as a less a respect for feelings or an empowerment of feelings of self-pain and complaining and those types of issues. So you have a very interesting dialectic, which did not lead to, I would say, a understanding of each spouse with each other, because they didn't, people didn't talk about the transgenerational trauma that they brought with them into the marriage. They talk about how they survive in this new emerging culture. So the background comes from there. So I was this kind of curious guy with, again, this dualism, this, being very objective and being able to deconstruct and solve puzzles and being, mathematically or quantitatively would be a better word, precocious. And, very, good enough in many things. And then this other part of me, which was more of this a conceptualizer, daydreamer. So you have a deconstruction on one side and you have a global big theory models of the world on the other. And that was basically my life. And it was the journey, if you really want to get to the personal one, is I used to wonder what's inside people's heads. I mean, it was as simple as that. What can we learn about another person, not by the words they're saying, but how they say their words, how their faces work, how their postures work. And suddenly you start seeing polyvagal theory come out from that. It's saying,
so you were interested in the way people embody what's going on inside in their head right from the beginning.
Yeah. Well, because there's such a disconnect. You see the gestures, you see the facial expression, you see the dismissiveness and of people or marginalization of others while using words like, positive words, but not in a way that you trust them and feel that you're being welcomed. And we've all experienced that. And we live in this world which is cortical centric and cognitive centric. And it basically says what you feel is not important. It's not important in your survival, and it's not important in creating we're going to get to this, the platform, the neurophysiological platform, so you can be bold and creative. So we have this paradox working in our lives, and that is our bodies are not acknowledged, meaning our physiological responses. Yet we're basically have these demands that our brain should be available to solve all these problems without understanding that the accessibility of certain neural pathways in the brain are totally dependent upon the physiological state you're in. Is your body safe or is it under a state of threat? It's something as simple as that. If your body's in a state of threat, you can't access certain areas of your brain. It just doesn't work.
This is something that I can't wait to get into because it relates to some other evolutionary theories that I know are also in question. So I just cannot wait to get there.
The part is that we're not going to get to the intellectual part unless we, as a species, unless we're respectful of what the body needs. So in a sense, we have this separation in our nervous system of a system that detects threat and shifts our bodily state. And that feeds back and affects how our brain works, meaning can we access these complicated areas? And so we have this separation we have a dependency on our physiological state for who we are, our ability to connect, to be accessible to others. So that dependency is there, yet we're trying to rule that dependency, deny it, or drug it using pharmaceuticals, or get it under control through addictions. So there's a neurophysiology for all of that. But the issue is, what is it to be a human? And this is really where polyvagal theory finally led me. And that it was that to be a human was to be socially connected with others, to be able to trust someone of your species, or in many situations, another appropriate mammal like a dog. So the issue is, can your body feel safe enough to be in close proximity with another? And this, to me, is really the strange journey that I went on to try to, in a sense, decode what it was that was going on inside of people, to try to understand it. And then started to understand that everything was being broadcast. So the intonation of people's voices, their facial expressions, their gestures were telling me in quite a reliable way their physiological state. And in a simplistic way, it said, are they physiologically safe, or are they reacting to a chronic threat? And so if you go back even, let's say, into your life or the lives of the people listening, and that is, go back to your childhood, go back to elementary school, go back to high school, go back to the notion of the educational system as being a chronic evaluative system, and the anxiety that that promotes in your physiology, in your body, and the insecurity that it can promote. So for me, I sit back at this stage of my life with really a true sense of gratitude. In a sense, I'm only beginning to understand what gratitude means. So it's like saying, for me, it's saying, there's nothing I want. I don't want to be someone else. I don't want more money. I don't want more fame. It's like, I want to be helpful. I want to be accessible. I want to be connected with other people. Because, and again, this is the because comes, it gets reinforced by the pandemic. Because during the pandemic, it doesn't matter how much money you have, what's missing, what's hurting, your opportunities to co-regulate with other people, to be in their presence, to have hugs for them.
Yeah, and the lack of connection, which, all of this work in psychology and neuroscience is coming closer and closer to this very, very important theme of connection. Stephen, if you don't mind, I want to move on because I want to get the nuts and bolts so that the listeners can understand the structures and the tools you're discussing, and then we can come back and apply that to things like gratitude and what it is to be human. So bite-sized chunks, because a lot of the public listening will be new to talking about the nervous system. Let's start with the vagal nerve itself, the subject of your theory. What does it actually do? And can you put that into a sort of evolutionary context so we can get a sense of what brought us up to now this huge reliance on this extraordinarily long and important nerve?
So even the framing of the question can be a misdirection. This is not to be critical, but it can be a misdirection of really the essence of what the theory is. So the vagus within polyvagal theory is really to remind us and to emphasize that the brain and the body, or the organs of the body, are connected, and they're connected with nerves, and the primary nerve of connection is the vagus, and the vagus is this big cranial nerve going from our brainstem down to virtually all the organs within our body. And most of the fibers within this big conduit are sensory. So it's really a surveillance system, yet in the neurophysiological world and the medical world, it's been viewed as a motor nerve, primarily because of its impact on the gut and its impact on the heart. So it's a cranial nerve, and it's a complicated nerve because it has sensory fibers coming up and has motor fibers going down. But the nerve changed during evolution, and the nerve actually changes during evolution enabled mammals to become social, to be safe in the presence of others, to communicate. So if we go back to the earlier question, what's going on in people's body? Polyvagal theory tells you, because through evolution, the area of the brainstem that regulates this vagal control of the heart and the bronchi, which calms us down and inhibits our fight, flight, sympathetic arousal, and sends signals to our nervous system below the gut, below the diaphragm, that everything's good. So we're not just reacting with diarrhea and constipation, we're supporting homeostasis.
Can you just unpack that for a second, Dr. Porges? The sympathetic nervous system is that which deals with fight and flight. Is that correct?
Well, that's again a misdirection. It also deals with enthusiasm, excitement. Everything that we love in life has a sympathetic component to it. But it's when it takes over the regulation of our autonomic nervous system into a highly mobilized state that interferes with our ability to connect and be in contact with others, and it does support fight flight. It's also been used to describe stress, with the misunderstanding that that sometimes sympathetic activation really gives us exuberance, and so they talk about good stress versus bad stress, as opposed to talking about how it gets tuned. The interesting part of the evolutionary history is it gets tuned by this newer. I didn't go to this point, but with mammals we have a unique branch of the vagus that goes to the heart and the bronchi. And this one is myelinated. It's very tightly regulated. But in doing that, that vagus also is involved. The signals from it are in part of the brainstem that controls the muscles of our face and head. So if we buy into this, if we understand this evolutionary phylogenetic through our evolutionary history, that the nerve controlling the heart and our bronchi to optimize oxygenation becomes a nerve that is greatly influenced by our face. And that means that the sensory parts of the muscles of the face and head go there, but also the motor parts become literally a parallel broadcasting unit of our visceral state. So the intonation of our voice is being regulated by a vagal nerve that's not going to a heart, it's going to a larynx. So the intonation of our voice is, in a way, mirroring and broadcasting our visceral state. So it's how people speak sends a signal to the other that their viscera is not in a fight flight. You can come close to me, I won't hurt you.
So there's a double function there, because on the one hand, it might be that I need to inform my tribe members that there's a threat, but at the same time, it might be on the contrary, that I'm looking for a mate, or I'm looking to sit down and have a good old laugh.
Right, because if you have a system, that ability to switch back and forth rapidly evolved with mammals because that myelinated vagal system. So we can, in a sense, remove a vagal brake, and we can visualize it as this conceptualization of an inhibitory action on our heart's pacemaker. But it also downregulates sympathetics. It's the calming. So when someone gets excited, what do we say? Take a deep breath, sit still. Well, when you exhale, the vagal brake is optimized. When you inhale, you start to block the vagal brake. So how do you get people upset? And when are they upset? Their breathing changes. They huff and they puff. They have short phrases. They're inhaling longer than they're exhaling. So we are adjusting our physiological state by an observable behavior.
Dr. Porges, I want to take you back to when you were studying all of this before the actual formation of your theory, because I'm interested in following the excitement of that personal process of scientific discovery, particularly because it sounds like it was very much part of your passion from the very, very start. What reactions did you notice in your subjects while studying the vagus nerve that led to the formation of the theory? And what conclusion? How did you draw your conclusions? I'm interested in that process of discovery.
It's far simpler.
Okay,
it was not.
Science is never simple. This must be a first time.
It's simple if you open your eyes and you forget what you were taught.
Well, so that's another question, isn't it?
I was doing work in obstetrics and neonatology, and that is, looking at fetuses as they were being born and newborns, especially high-risk newborns, preterm babies, so I could watch that early developmental phase. And I was observing that the indicators of vagal function that I was using which was a measure of heart rate variability called respiratory sinus arrhythmia, was not developed. So it was, in a sense, a risk factor. And I saw this as kind of a universal diagnostic. If their respiratory sinus arrhythmia component of heart rate variability was low, they were at great risks.
So if your heart rate is constricted and you can't actually vary it much in response to these various nervous stimuli, that's a problem for these babies.
It's a problem, but there's a very interesting issue. So number one, I had learned, and everyone had learned at the time, that the vagus support homeostatic function, and that more vagal tone was more positive, and that when you had these rhythmic oscillations, this was an indicator that the system was really doing its job. Now, the other part was that within obstetrics and neonatology, there was another version, and that is a version that talked about clinical bradycardia, where the heart rates got too slow, and this is a response to non-oxygen or hypoxia. And this is called bradycardia, where heart rate gets slow. But bradycardia was also a vagal phenomenon. So the issue became what I called the vagal paradox. How can the vagus be protective, yet how can it kill you? So what happened was, within obstetrics and neonatology, rather than emphasizing the neural regulation of these two distinct patterns of heart rate, they became descriptive without going into the physiology. I went into the physiology. And the physiology was that these were being regulated by different parts of the brainstem. And they were following an evolutionary pattern, because what do reptiles do when they're under threat? They immobilize, they stop breathing, they have bradycardia, and they even defecate. Why do they defecate? So that they don't have the metabolic demands of digestion. So I could see this reaction in a phylogenetic tree, and then you could see this developmentally. Not that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, but it gives you hints. You can see that in the fetus, the older vagus that regulates the gut comes on board, then the sympathetic nervous system, and then finally, during the last trimester, this newer vagus starts to work, and it starts to create this calming of the system. But the system is now linked to the muscles of the face and the head. So what does a baby do when the baby is born? Suckle, use the muscles of the face and head. How does a mother calm a full-term baby? Using prosodic voices. And so you start seeing this whole sociality of the newborn as being a reflection of this evolutionary transition of linking the neural control of the face and vocalizations, listening, with the vagal regulation of the heart, calming us down. So what I was talking about earlier, about looking at people and listening to their voice, I could see this unfolding in that high-risk newborn. And the issue is, I could see this system coming on as a system of co-regulation. So if you think of a mother and the baby nursing, or the mother singing to the baby, or the mother and the baby, their bodies conforming, you start seeing this co-regulation. It's not caregiving, it's co-regulation. So when we talk to each other, it's not me just talking to you. That never will work. It has to be a dialogue. I have to be listening as well.
Dr. Porges, do you think you could then take this sort of the data we've just been discussing, the things that brought you to this? Could you just tell us as briefly as possible? I know it's impossible, such a broad and fascinating theory. Where did the data lead you? If you were to present this to a lay audience, how would you lay out the theory itself?
Well, we have to go back to the question you asked, and that is, what happened during evolution? And with evolution, we ended up with functionally 3 primary autonomic circuits. And they follow the adaptive survival of more ancient vertebrates until we became mammals. And the mammal was different because survival required co-regulation. So it means that connectedness, trust in others, sociality is the pathway of survival for mammals. And cooperation has been, even though we misinterpret Darwin by saying survival is of the fittest, we think of that as being physically stronger. when in reality, we're really talking about cooperation. The fittest are really the species that could cooperate and solve complex problems. So this is our legacy. Our legacy is connectedness. And we learn a lot. So to the lay public, we understand that this system of evolution, of connectedness, of trust, and feeling part of a relationship is really our evolutionary mandate. Let's put it that way. It's our biological imperative. We are a species that needs to connect. But when we start looking at the world we're in, and we start looking at the world of trauma, which is the world that truly embraced me because I gave it a narrative. And what trauma is, it's really enables people to understand that their body basically went through, or the term is dissolution, goes through evolution in reverse. It gives up its connectedness attributes, its facial expressivity, its intonation of voice, the ability to feel safe with another, and moves into states that are really evolved to be defensive, including a more dominant sympathetic fight-flight system, and also this very ancient immobilization, older vagus, a different vagus that we still have, but most of that vagus goes to our gut. So what happens when we really feel betrayed? Or it goes to our gut. And what's the common problem in our modern society? People have irritable bowel syndrome. Their gut isn't working because they're not getting cues through their, in a sense, newer vagal social system to tell the gut, do your job. There's nothing wrong. Instead, our bodies are on full alert most of the time, and so we can't give it the cue to relax and digest. So digestion requires a body that's not in movement. So we need to, in a sense, give our body cues that it's safe, and then digestion works. Within the medical community, our model is if you have digestion problems, the problem's at the locus of the end organ. So it's the gut that has the problem. Or if you have a heart problem, it's the heart that has the problem, not the neural regulation. Polyvagal theory says there's another way of looking at things, and this is far from original. In fact, in 1949, a Swiss physiologist got a Nobel Prize. His name was Walter Hess, and he got it for basically articulating that the brain regulated our visceral organs, and in a sense argued that there really is only one nervous system. And so when we get into discussions like with consciousness, it only makes sense if we think of an integrated nervous system that includes neural regulation of our bodily organs and the impact of our bodily organs on our brain function.
So what we're talking about here really is a bidirectionality, isn't it? Between the functionality of the organs being connected through the vagus nerve back to including the face as well, but back to the brainstem.
Yeah.
Talk about this bidirectionality for a moment. Just give us an example of one going in one direction and it going in the other, because that's going to be quite important, isn't it?
Well, we can give you two examples. Visualize something horrible that's happened to you, and then attend to how your body feels. You know, you feel it in your gut, you feel it in your heart, you feel a drop in your stomach. And then visualize, or don't even visualize, take a deep breath and exhale slowly and see how your body feels. Or take a deep breath with a rapid, a slow inhalation and a rapid exhalation, see if you start feeling more mobilized. The bidirectionality is really giving respect and honor to your bodily state and how it impacts your brain and how you structure your narrative. Let's say for you, you have, I'm sure this may have happened, you get a call to interview for something, and you get the part, and how do you feel?
The fear in my job as an actor, here I am 20 years later, I'm still, the heart rate and the breathing before you go into audition, very difficult to control.
You have the examples, but again, in acting, if you go to kind of a Stanislavski method acting, what is that all about? It's about getting the visceral feelings to enable you to act the role. So it's the method is really a respect of bodily feelings. And can you get the bodily feelings through visualization? So it's a real, if you thought of acting as basically implementing this bidirectionality, you have all your examples. For people who are academics, it's really a strange world because many of them are basically extraordinarily vulnerable and not bold. So we can go back to personal history. And when I reflect on personal history, the part that I'm really taken by in terms of my own journey, and this is the aging adult thinking about the younger child, and that is where did the boldness come from? It's like, where did the assuredness come from? Because to create and to foster and try to bring new ideas into any discipline results in an interesting dialogue that occurs. In fact, many people don't like to do anything novel because it creates a vulnerability, and they're not up for that. They don't want that. They want acceptance. They want to be part of a family. And you find this in terms of discipline, networking within disciplines, and you also find it in the inability to be informed by, I was going to use the term good-natured criticism, but it is in a sense where people feel that it's a level playing field and their job is to further knowledge, not to take things personally. It's a very interesting tightrope within the academic world because people are very identified with their products, and most people that I've met don't want to be on the edge.
And I think we also live in a very masculine society, and a society that's been given this, that men aren't supposed to be emotional, that we're supposed to sort of somehow control that. And I imagine that part of that sort of suppression does lead to some of these internal wranglings that you're talking about.
I think that's a very interesting point to bring up because, again, I've learned so much about human behavior, human thought, human feelings from the world of trauma. And what you're really describing is how do we make ourselves numb?
Yes.
And the first thing is we don't honor or respect or come in contact with our feelings. And pretty soon that becomes the way who we are. And that becomes dissociation from feelings. And pretty soon we become dissociative about other cues coming into our world. And then we become a survivor of trauma because we've turned off our body.
Very interesting point. And I'd like to come back to this. I want to stick with this bidirectionality for a moment. I've got this strong image of the nerve stretching into the intestines and the lungs and the heart, and then coming up into the brain. And I'm imagining a bidirectionality whereby, let's say, there is a perceived threat. We'll come back to the difference between a real threat and a perceived threat in a bit, but let's just say there's a perceived threat. I move into that comes into the brain, and I move into a hyper-vigilant state. That then goes back to influence the way the blood and the heart are working in the organs, and things start to get reassigned. Energy starts to get reassigned. And the more I move into that state, my face then starts to show signs of distress, which is then sending that back out into the world. And I might then receive more of that. Presumably, these feedbacks can amplify even communally, sort of in our communities as well. Do we see this kind of extreme polarization of these two feedback loops in society? Is that something you've noticed?
Well, I think you described it, but we're going to play back or rewind a little bit because there's two levels of feedback loops is within the body and between bodies. So you need to, once you acknowledge that the human nervous system involves sociality as a mode of regulation or co-regulation, then you have the answer to your narrative. The first part is the feedback in the society of people not saying how hard, hello. There, in a sense, in fact, the pandemic creates a series of issues because now social encroachment or social space becomes a threat. And our nervous systems are adapting and learning. So if I'm walking down a street, which I don't do very frequently, and there's someone walking the other direction, I'll walk away. Now, those are cues to a body's nervous system of being marginalized or being dismissive. And they become kind of regular. Now, people that I don't know or people without a mask for sure become threats to my nervous system. So, but you want to go a little bit further in your explanation. That is, let's say that I am angry. Now, once I'm angry, my face changes and I present that face to others. Now, they will feel that I'm angry at them unless the narrative changed that we're both angry at someone else. That's conspiracy type theories. So the anger and the directionality of it becomes targeted at someone else. And then what you start getting really is a metaphor of team sports. Team sports are that you mobilize without fear because you need to mobilize to play the game. But how do you keep your body from not being aggressive and just mobilize without fear? Well, you talk to your friends, you make facial expressions. In a way, that's what's happening with these, let's say, conspiracy theorist groups. And that is, they're targeting, like a game, their mobilization towards something, but they're utilizing their social engagement system, the face-to-face and their vocalization to each other's, as co-regulatory features calming themselves down. So now they're safe within the context of being angry at another person. And the healthy individual says, I'm safe while playing volleyball or playing basketball, even though I'm highly mobilized, and that mobilization could be directed as aggression, but it's contained because I'm playing with friends.
Well, and I wonder if this tribalism that you're describing is again quite hardwired, because anybody from the outside, in inverted commas, in our primordial roots would have immediately be viewed with suspicion. And I wonder if we're not just seeing a sort of a fall back into some of that tribalism.
Well, I think we have to think a little bit more about human civilizations, human history, and different cultures. And many cultures had the invited guest model, that you come to my house, what do I do first? The good guest basically feeds. Ingestion, eating of food, is stimulating all the nerves that are part of our social engagement system. Mm-hmm. So we go out for a drink or we go out for a meal because ingestion utilizes that same circuit of the face and the vagus. We don't say, hey, let's get together and digest our food, because that's using that older vagus, which can easily be shifted into a shutting down defense. So that older vagus needs to have the containment of safety to facilitate digestion. So many cultures, they also used to have a siesta. You eat a big lunch. What do? You go into a safe place. The idea that people took naps is just part of it, but they were able, the narrative is you could go into a safe place to allow your food to be digested. Because if you're hyper-vigilant, you're going to interfere with digestion.
Stephen, can we just back up to the feedback loop you mentioned internally? Because I think that's really important for our awareness going into the rest of the conversation. Out of connection, what is the potential risk of a negative or even a positive feedback loop if switched around within the body?
Well, it creates chronic, the issue of if it's positive feedback, meaning that if your body moves into a state of threat, it gets amplified, the threat. And this is when you get into an argument with someone and it escalates. So we have all the metaphors and the physiology just gets overwhelming and people can't control their behavior. So the negative feedback is that violations or disruptions to interactions are part of the normal thing. But the real issue is the skill in repairing. How do we repair? How do we say, I'm sorry? How do we calm each other down? What I often like to say is, have you ever won an argument? You can't win arguments because they're all about bodily reactions. It's not about the information. So there's no amount of information in an argument that is going to change the way the person thinks or feels unless they're in a calm physiological state. Then they'll be able to listen.
Well, you've got such a solution-led way of talking about this. I can't wait to get to the tools bit at the end, but let's stick with the science for now. Now, you speak about this hyper-vigilant state that I'm interested in what defines this emotional threshold beyond which the threat system takes over from the frontal cortex. And we start to see defensiveness dominating clear thinking. How does it work, this threshold? And does it vary from person to person?
Well, of course, it varies from person to person. And the threshold in a polyvagal term is really dependent upon the effectiveness of the vagal brake, which really is this constraint on the sympathetics and on your defenses. As long as this newer mammalian vagal system is on board, then you can mobilize, you can immobilize, and everything is kind of like kept within a range of optimal interaction. So my friend Dan Siegal, he uses the term window of tolerance. The window of tolerance, which one wants to broaden, make wider, is really regulated by the accessibility of this vagal brake. The interesting part, and this is where my current research is going, which was really decades on studying what might be called vagal tone through the heart through this myelinated vagus, it's now coming up with another metric, and this is what I call vagal efficiency. So it appears that even that if we start talking about groups that have autonomic dysfunction or dysautonomia or people with trauma, that they may appear to have reasonable vagal tone, but they really can't use it. So the part is really interesting. We're doing a simple assessment, and that is to see how systematically the vagal brake is removed when we put physical demands on that autonomic nervous system, like changing postures, from going from supine to seated to standing. Each time you shift the posture, your heart rate will get higher and higher because the heart rate has to go faster to get oxygenated blood to your brain. We've also put people on exercise bikes, and you see the same thing. And hypothetically, at least this was the hypothesis, that there should be a systematic withdrawal of the vagal brake with this increase in heart rate. And the answer is that's, for most people, it's like linear, but not for everyone. And if you have a trauma history, there's a disorganization.
Well, that's my next question, is about the effect of trauma. So let's just imagine we've got sort of a hypothetical, probably non-existent person that has had no trauma whatsoever. But let's imagine we've got a very low trauma individual, and we are looking at them, we're looking at their threshold alongside somebody who's suffered trauma of various different types in their childhood. How does the triggering associated with trauma affect the threshold in that second traumatized person? Is it a sort of like a virus underneath the threshold that kind of grows from underneath, or does it just bring the threshold down?
Well, we have to actually do a redefinition. We have to go back for a moment, because in the world of trauma, there's also a misdirection, and that is the emphasis on event and not on reaction or bodily feelings. So polyvagal theory says traumatic events are important, but the real issue in terms of outcome is how did your body react to that? So this means that some people with what might be viewed by others as being minor events can be physiologically transformative. And for others, where events may appear to be devastating, the person may walk right through it. So we have to have that.
The actual neurological effects at the time of the trauma.
Right. The neural reaction in terms of the autonomic nervous system. So we're seeing, did the autonomic nervous system see this as life-threatening, or did it see it as a transitory threat that mobilization would serve? And mobilization is our go-to defense. And when the event passes, our body normally goes back to this newer, vagally regulated, resilient, greater window of tolerance, efficient use of the vagal brake. And I think what happens, and this is where you're getting in terms of the threshold, I think for some individuals, and I'm not sure whether it's the severity of their reaction or the chronicity of having many reactions, there's a retuning of the system into a more, let's say, adaptive way, and that is a different dissociation or disembodiment. So the efficient vagal brake is really saying you're embodied. Your body responds to demands and it recovers, and when you need to move, you've got to have the metabolic resources. But more important, when you no longer need to move, your body calms down. And if you have a felt traumatic, a transformed neural regulation due to the trauma, the system is going to stay in a complicated state of flux because it doesn't know where to go.
Mm. Well, listen, for listeners who want to understand this in more depth, Dr. Porges has got a book which if I understand correctly, Steve, is more directed at the general public. It's called The Pocket Guide to Polyvagal Theory, The Transformative Power of Feeling Safe. Steve, is that a good place for readers to start if they're looking for an insight?
It's a good place to start. There'll be a new book within a year. It's called Polyvagal Safety, which is really very focused on many of the things we're talking about. And it's, I would say, in that book, first of all, the Pocket Guide is readable. Let's start with that. The Polyvagal Safety is actually, most of it is quite readable.
Wonderful. And for those of you who may be more in the professional neurosciences or students or postgrad, you also have a much more science-orientated book.
Yeah, I'd also invite, if people are in the science mode, they can go to Google Scholar and put my name in it, and they'll see lots of things, and it will direct them to getting
very diverse career. But let's come back to connection and social engagement, because it is something that I think is going to come up over and over again on this podcast in many, many different sort of scenarios. And I think we do need a multidisciplinary way of thinking here. I think we can safely say that mammals are wired for connection and social engagement, and a lack of either leads to mental health issues of one sort or another, depending on resilience. But our facial expression and our tone of voice are fundamental to the way our communication will be received. Can you tell us the implications that your theory has as a result of this for how we educate and how we treat sickness?
Yeah, well, first of all, two types of sickness. You want to talk about
I put physical and mental here.
Mental and physical illness are the same. And that's where we have to start, that they utilize similar neural circuits. So in this sense, when we look at a person's face who's physically ill, they lose neural control of the upper part of their face, just like someone who might have certain mental health issues.
The body has... Stop you for a moment, because I'm still reeling from hearing you say something that I've known for many years, but felt that I wasn't qualified scientifically to say. You've just said that physical and mental illness are the same. Now, the mind-body connection is well known, but it's quite controversial talking in such black and white terms about the mind-body connection, isn't it?
Well, first of all, I don't even use the word mind-body in my work. I use the word brain-body.
Well, there you go.
And that's no controversy, because that's how the nervous system evolved. And then I refer people back to Walter Hess's Nobel Prize speech, which 70 years ago documented how the organs were affected by the brain and how the brain affected the organs. So that's a given. The question really is, in the world of physical health, do the medical providers understand this? Are they taught this? And the answer is no, they're not taught this.
What's wrong with the education, the university system, the medical system, that this has been swept under the carpet for so long?
First of all, it's harder as a concept for people to understand. It's much easier to think about levels where you give people medicine or you fix things with surgery than to think about feedback loops and regulatory circuits. The concept of regulatory circuits is not a comfort zone for physicians. So the first part is we can't get angry at the medical profession because they're doing what they think is good. Their intentions are good. Their toolkit is limited. And the toolkit's limited because they have been asking the wrong questions, or I should say all the wrong questions, but many of the wrong questions. And we go back to this obsession on end organ function. And that's when you go into get your annual physical, you get your blood test. It's all about end organ function. there's no indicator of neural regulation of those end organs. If the neural regulation of the end organs is dysfunctional, then over time, that end organ will become diseased. So you start seeing the antecedents, and we call those antecedents stress or toxic stress. We separate it from the physiology and put it out in the context because we don't allow or we don't support research on measuring dynamic neural regulation of end organs. There's very little out there. That's really what I had been vested in for so long. And my work was really just focused on the end organ neural regulation of the heart and what that told me about healthiness. And that was heart rate variability and refining that metric into a measure of respiratory science arrhythmia, because the understanding of the neural pathways for respiratory science arrhythmia could lead to and have led to a validated index of cardiac vagal tone. So it is possible to get a metric of how the systems works. And now I'm actually using that to look at vagal efficiency, which is another aspect of how vagal tone is used. So we can get a good metric of this, and then we can see how it's functionally used. The interesting part is virtually all subsets of populations that have characteristics of dysautonomia or autonomic dysfunction have lower vagal efficiency. And we're actually writing the papers to document these issues now.
So that brings us back to what polyvagal can teach us about how we educate and how we treat sickness. Let's deal first with sickness.
Well, let's talk about what physicians hate. They hate this area called medically unexplained symptoms, which includes irritable bowel syndrome, dysautonomia, fibromyalgia, and often migraines, because they have no measure. They can't document it. They get all the symptoms. And I think vagal efficiency is going to be one of the first surrogate variables that will tap into this. So it will give it a concrete validation as opposed to it's all in your head, which is how people with these symptoms are treated. They said, see a psychiatrist, and as opposed to saying, this is an atypical neural regulation of your viscera, and it's not optimizing homeostatic function. Now, how do we fix that? Or how do we optimize that? And part of what polyvagal theory tells me, or tells us, is that the pathway or the portal of cues of safety through social connection are primary pathways to optimize vagal regulation of our autonomic nervous system. We should never minimize the power of social connectedness in sending cues to our nervous system that it's okay to serve homeostatic function. We don't have to be hyper-vigilant and defensive. So our bodies are so bombarded with cues of threat that our nervous system's ability to support homeostatic function continuously is being compromised.
Homeostatic function, Steve?
Yeah, homeostatic function is really the feedback loops of our nervous system that support health, growth, and restoration. So even the word stress doesn't really tell us anything. It comes from physics, or actually material. It's engineering, stress of girders and other things. But if we use the term homeostasis, which says, how is our body serving in this appropriate negative feedback loop to support health, growth, and restoration, then we would define disruptions in homeostasis as their indicators of stress, as opposed to cortisol levels or sympathetic activation. We would say stress is really when our nervous system loses its capacity to be co-regulated in the presence of another.
And presumably something similar can influence our ability to memorize and to learn and to absorb new information. So this has implications for education too.
Absolutely. And actually, that's a part of the passion now, is to get these concepts into education, because in a sense, for educational systems to respect the need for children to have neural exercise opportunities, meaning recess, play, social interaction, because the educational model was that these are diversions from cognitive and intellectual pursuits. Polyvagal theory says these are the building blocks to create the physiological neural states that enable efficient processing of information.
And this leads on to my next question about the Triune theory of brain. But let's just lay the groundwork here. If I am a kid and I am being scared by my teacher, I'm in the unfortunate position that my 10-year-old boy has a teacher who likes to shame the children. She thinks this is a pedagogical method to get them to conform. And it's remarkable. My son has extraordinary memory, and he has literally not been able to memorize anything since he's been in the presence of this particular new teacher. Tell me, what is happening neurophysiologically when we feel that unsafe in the presence of an educator?
Well, I think this becomes quite obvious. The accessibility of the areas of the brain where executive functions are occurring, where memory traces are laid down, it's not accessible. Why are they not accessible? Because our nervous system is adaptive and your son is under threat of survival. So the nervous system retunes and saying, I'm under threat. How do I deal with that? So it's the proximal challenge is the threat. And so the narrative saying that you've got to get over this and solve these problems, the body can't do that. The body has to be, in a sense, served to be calmed and to trust. So your son is telling you that he doesn't trust the environment in which he is being schooled.
It's such a tough one because our whole culture, I mean, I'm sure, Dr. Porges, you probably grew up, again, like my parents, and in a generation where this was very common, this style of disciplinary and authoritarianism. And, certain things worked because you were scared that you were going to be punished. But I think on the whole, it's been very limiting for society. But I want to just segue that into my next question, because there's a question here that I really want to put to you, Stephen, before we run out of time. The Triune theory of brain evolution is under a lot of criticism these days. That and the limbic system conception of emotion that it kind of draws on. I'm going to be speaking with neuroscientist and psychologist Dr. Joseph Ledoux, who gives a very good critique of this, and he's a specialist on emotions. But where do you stand on this, Dr. Porges? Can you tell us roughly what the famous theory holds, and to what extent you think these critiques are valid?
Well, let's talk about what the positive part, and this is Paul McLean's Triune brain, and he also is the first to conceptualize a limbic system. So, he's a historical neurophysiologist, had a great impact on psychology. But let's take what it really brings. It brings our attention to the fact that the brain changed through evolution. Did it change into the three brains like the Triune theory says? Not necessarily. Did it change in the way that he says it changed? So they're actually these distinct circuits? Not necessarily. Polyvagal theory focuses on below that. It focuses on how the brainstem changed and its regulation of our underlying physiological state, and creates the platform for all the models of higher brain function. So I see polyvagal theory as not contradictory, but basically serving as an understanding of the neural platform for psychological constructs. And this leads me to Joe Ledoux's wonderful work, and that is when you start talking about emotions, they sit on top of the brainstem's regulation of visceral state. You don't have emotions without changes in bodily state. The problem is that people wanted to find isomorphic one-to-one relationships between emotions and physiological state. But the brainstem is a very small area compared to the higher brain structures. So we basically can have physiological platforms where one is the platform for many. So we have, in a sense, physiological states that would support mobilization or basically emotions that require sympathetic excitation. We would have a brainstem state that would support the neural regulation of the face to provide more calming or socially engaging positive emotions. And then we would have a neurophysiological regulation of the brainstem that says, get out of here. just shut down, become vacant.
The reason I ask, Steve, is because, we're also going to be speaking to Patty Whiffler, who founded the wonderful hand-in-hand parenting technique, which was based on some of these limbic system ideas. And the way she explains it, and by the way, we're using hand-in-hand with our children, and we've seen an absolutely massive change in their behavior, just in a state of safety and non-threat. They thrive in every possible way, and they are infinitely better behaved. But what I'm really interested in here is this idea of an over-aroused emotional state, in that theory referred to as the limbic system being activated and blocking the frontal cortex reasoning of this sort of higher level of this evolution. Now, can we salvage anything from this? It's fairly clear that this isn't quite the way the brain works, nor the evolution of the brain has worked by the criticisms. But can we salvage anything? Is there a different way of describing that process where, shall we say, the emotional state trumps the and kind of overwhelms the ability to think clearly? Is there anything we can salvage here, or is it just the wrong way of looking at it?
Well, you're in a way asking the wrong person, but I will give you the wrong answer. The part, because when I'm asked some of these questions, I say, do we need the word emotion? And I'm saying that emotion is a psychological construct, and we're going to get into problems when we try to create this neurophysiology of a psychological construct. As we go back to more primary, meaning more foundational physiological strategies, more adaptive strategies, and talk about physiological state of movement, immobilization, and containment of movement, which is safety, and containment of immobilization, which we would call intimacy, we start seeing these ranges of things that can emerge from these states. And they can utilize higher brain structures. It doesn't mean that they create a signature for a specific emotion, but they are basically the foundational point upon which this stands. I've had the same discussion with a friend who unfortunately passed a couple of years ago, Jaak Panskep, and he had seven circuits in the brain. And the problem, my problem with his presentation was they were basically focusing on those areas of the brain were, in a sense, locked to his circuits, which are psychological constructs, without an understanding, or let's just term vague appreciation, that the brain is dynamic and adjusts and does different things at different times. That these circuits were really based upon underlying foundational states of mobilization or metabolic demands. So polyvagal theory brings you down to, let's say, the most simplest basic, and that has to do with metabolism, metabolic resources, and concept of an organism being safe and reacting to threat. So it's really down on these very primitive levels. And we find that through the evolution, those circuits became embedded in how we related to each other, in a sense of neural regulation of the face and voice. Mm. And what we're kind of stuck with when we get to emotions is face and voice.
And Mike Gazzaniga, in our discussion, speaks about the fact that really, again, like you said, it's the wrong question. They're different layers, they're completely different levels of description, and much better to talk about the way these related layers. He's talking about finding a language to discuss the relation between the layers that actually are related.
Discussions tend to be top down, and what Polyvagal says, let's force you into a bottom-up dialogue. Because bottom-up has simplicity, has parsimony, and top-down has complexity.
And it's technical, which helps.
And if we can simplify the dialogue, because with a bottom-up simplicity model, one state supports many. When we go from top down, we get into specificity based upon psychological constructs that are looking in search of a neurophysiological substrate.
Mm. Steve, we're running out of time, and I desperately wanted to speak to you briefly about the power of listening before we come on to the last question. Social engagement is not just about feeling safe to speak, because communication relies not only on the speaker, but on the ability to be heard and listened to. Do you see that our society, where perhaps we're listening less than we used to. We're more frenetic. We've got more distractions. We're more narcissistic in terms of self-serving consumerism. Does this amplify our sense of not being heard and therefore not feeling safe?
Well, the answer is obvious. The big issues in the United States are really about marginalized populations not being heard, losing their voice. So there are all these metaphors: not being heard, being marginalized, loss of voice. People do not always, the priority is not necessarily you need to do what I want you to do, but you need to hear what I have to say. Because if you listen to me and respond to me, I am real. If I don't listen to you, you're marginalized, you don't exist. And that's what this reciprocity or co-regulation is about. So the body is reacting to being dismissed, someone turning away from them. These are, in a sense, very anciently wired into our mammalian nervous system. And that is, you engage someone and you say, "Hi, Steve," and I turn away, or I look at my watch, or I pick up my phone. And you say, "You got a moment?" You say, "Don't worry, I can hear you while I'm doing this." How does your body react? Your body is already like this. So the answer is yes. Listening to me, though, here's where it goes right into polyvagal theory and what I call the social engagement system. So we talked about the face and the voice, but we didn't talk about the middle ear muscles. The middle ear muscles contract when our upper part of our face becomes alive. And that's why we can hear people in noisy bars when we look at them and we're happy with them, because the muscles contract, and in contracting, the low frequency background sounds that our body uses to detect predator, they get bounced off the eardrum and voice goes in. But if we're in a state of threat, the middle ear muscles can't contract. So for your son in the classroom, he may not even be hearing what the teacher is saying because his body may be in such a state of threat that the middle ear muscles just are relaxed and are now picking up lower frequency predator sound. He may feel that he's being yelled at. He may complain about background noises bothering him because his body is in a state of hypervigilance. The final part is listening as a metaphor is powerful, but listening as actually this neurophysiological feature of being safe with others has been critical to the survival of humans, because when the mother uses her prosodic voice to calm the baby crying, she is changing that physiological state by entering cues of safety in a frequency band that tells the brain, you're safe. Now, I developed an intervention that's called Safe and Sound Protocol that is based on those same principles.
Tell us about that. I was hoping it might come up.
So basically, it presents stealth cues of safety to tell the body, relax. Now, the interesting part of that is with children, it's been extraordinarily successful in reducing hypersensitivities to sounds and improving auditory processing. But the interesting thing from a theoretical point of view has been within the trauma community. And within the trauma community, people with severe trauma history, survivors of trauma, would listen and their bodies would kind of relax. And suddenly that relaxation became a trigger of vulnerability and the body's recoiled. And so we learned something. We learned that if you have a trauma history, cues of safety can trigger reactions. So we now have
safety, because when you thought you were safe and then you were traumatized, goodness me, how do you get around that? That's difficult.
Titration and narrative. So you use it slowly, little bits of it. You, in a sense, become aware of your bodily feelings, and you're now in the safe presence with a therapist or other safe people. And it basically resolves itself, but it has to be titrated extraordinarily slowly with great awareness and respect for the other person or for the client's reactivity. So the client is learning that their body is actually picking up cues of safety, and wham, those cues of safety remind the memories that are encoded of violation of trust and injury. And that's what trauma is. It's a violation of trust. And so the cues of safety can be utilized by an astute therapist, titrated and basically as a neural exercise of extending or expanding that window of tolerance, that range of autonomic function.
And indigenous people are an interesting example here because they've suffered
Well,
more than their fair share of injustice at the hands of colonial supremacy. And I was struck by one elder who said that listening was an active part of their justice system. She said that the reality of the injustice can't be wiped out, even with a proof of guilt, but it can be accepted by the victim if we feel our perspective in the injustice has been heard and witnessed. Do you think that this idea of being heard or witnessed has an actual neurobiological influence in the healing of trauma, or is that going too far?
Well, it's not going too far. And actually, I was going to move you into the characters used in Chinese for the word listening. It has heart, it has ear, it has the brain and focus. Basically, it's what Polyvagal Theory calls the social engagement system. So listening is the integration of the body with the information coming through that acoustic channel. And what the elders are telling you is that there's a transformation occurring within the body when they're listening to. It doesn't take the pain away, it doesn't take the event away, but it changes how their body responds to the events. What's going on in the United States with Black Lives Matter has similarity, and the bit with Jeffrey Epstein's abuse of young women who had their voice removed. It was the same thing. They wanted to tell their story. And telling their story is, in a way, honoring their experience and enabling them to be re-embodied. And any form of marginalization we use this term social justice, but it really means marginalization and not being heard. And if we go to the characters of the Chinese word listening, we're ripping out their hearts by not listening to them. And they're telling you that.
It's definitely going to be a one-legged creature if there's listening, if there's communication without listening, isn't it?
Yes.
Stephen, thank you for your time. We're just going to have one last question here because it's something you do talk about a lot. I love this idea that neurobiology can improve our lives, and you talk about this a lot, and it's clear in the way you speak, the passion with which you speak, that is your ultimate intention. And in that sense, it goes far beyond scientific research or trying to understand the brain. It seems to me that mindfulness of how we speak and how we listen just isn't enough, given that most of us have more or less trauma that can be triggered at any moment by completely unknown sort of variables within a good conversation with, potentially good listening and good communication. It seems to me that that's not enough if you've got those triggers coming up. Can you recommend some tools from your many years of experience of using polyvagal theory in practice that might help us to sort of bypass some of those really difficult things to disactivate, those triggers themselves?
Well, let's start with two things. One is we have to be good observers of our own bodily feelings. We have to be at home in our body. So that becomes the first part. The second part is we have to honor what our body does. So for many people, including, let's say, the underlying motivation for your statement is that it's a disappointment that people have in their body's reactions. So they already want to change it. And the first step is really honor what your body is doing, kind of understand what it's doing, and then figure out how you can let's just convince your body that it's in a safe world. But maybe it's not. Maybe your body is defensive for good reasons, and then honor that it's doing that. So what I'm saying is don't try to hack your body, which many people want to do. Turn off the feedback that it's giving you. Be aware of what that feedback is really trying to tell you. That's the first one. Once you get that, your first task is to, by honoring your body, understand that you can have some agency or intentionality to move your body out of environments in which it is damaging to them. Your son in the classroom doesn't have that agency. He can't get up and leave the classroom. But for many of us, when we are feeling discomfort, we can say, I need a little time by myself. I want to sit by myself. I want to listen to some music. I want to calm myself. I want to do some breathing. Breathing is very important. As we learn to slow up our exhalations, we're turning on our vagus. Part of the discussion I didn't bring up was my period of time of being a musician, which was when I was young, and I was a clarinetist. And a clarinet player is taking rapid inhalations and slow exhalations, using breath to play the instrument, listening with the middle ear muscles, creating an embouchure. Is basically wind instruments become a polyvagal neural exercise of the social engagement system. Singing is another one. Learn that there are various things that we can do, especially if we do them with other people, like singing in a group or playing in a wind ensemble, where you're maintaining social engagement while exercising all the elements of that system. So it's there. Yoga becomes a portal, especially aspects of yoga like pranayama yoga, which is yoga of breath. These are really portals into the polyvagal window of the autonomic nervous system.
So a mixture of breathing techniques. Stephen, tell us about the where we can find all of your advice on this. Presumably this is on your website, or you've got a new website coming out.
Yeah, there are two websites. There's my own, StephenPorges.com, but we just launched the Polyvagal Institute, which is a not-for-profit organization that's focused on conveying education. It's polyvagalinstitute.org, and that just got launched about a week ago. It's going to be a website for education about polyvagal theory and for practitioners who want to learn more about it. So it has it's a strong educational mission on this. And we hope to create special interest groups that deal with social justice issues, education issues, as well as the mental health, and even organizational issues. So like organizations could be organized as being more polyvagal informed. And we think about the culture within organizations, whether it's all about companies or, let's say, even universities. They're not very respectful of people's bodily feelings.
Well, I must confess, Stephen, it is such a joy to hear those words coming out of the mouth of a professional neuroscientist and psychologist, because to hear that kind of thinking finding its way back into the profession itself, into the education system itself, into the university system itself, I think is a very, very good sign for the future of this, not least it trickling down into the public field. So listeners, do please get over to the Polyvagal Institute's new website. You can also find out more in the short volume, The Pocket Guide to Polyvagal Theory, The Transformative Power of Feeling Safe. And there is all kinds of resources out there inspired by Stephen's work. Should you be interested in some more practical therapeutic approaches for that, not least the I'm just going to find it, the Safe and Sound protocol. Is that something we can find online, Steve, the Safe and Sound?
Sure. You can, if you go to my webpage, there is a click that will put you onto a special landing page. So that's StephenPorges.com and Safe and Sound protocol. What's interesting now is that there are over 3,000 people have been trained to deliver it. And the system went remote, meaning that it can be delivered remotely now by providers and monitored through video conferencing. And it went remote in mid-April, and over 100,000 sessions have already been delivered remotely. And that just gave this big, I got a great smile, because it really meant that it was impacting on tens of thousands of people.
And Steve, in terms of good big smiles, I think there are a lot of people out there who, over the many years you've been out putting this message and this work out into the public field, have been touched and have had their lives, if in a greater or lesser way, a change. So, Stephen, thank you for being with us on Chasing Consciousness. I've got a million more questions, so I may be back in touch for the second series, and wishing you all the very best with the new website.
Well, thank you, Freddie, and I enjoyed the time with you. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.